In a small American diner, an ordinary morning turned into something no one expected. You'll find out what happened next. Comment where you're watching from, subscribe, and leave a like. The morning at Silver Pine Diner began with the kind of quiet rhythm that came naturally to places which had seen decades of travelers, locals, and tired workers pass through. Sunlight leaked through blinds that had been hanging since the late 80s, slicing the room into gentle stripes of pale gold that shimmered across the chrome napkin holders and the red leather booths. The low hiss of bacon on the grill and the faint hum of the old refrigerator blended with the soft clinking of plates coming from the kitchen. It was the kind of noise that soothed more than distracted, an invitation for anyone weary from the road. This wasn't a fancy place, and it wasn't trying to be. It was honest, worn, sturdy, and full of little stories no one had ever bothered to collect. It was, in its own quiet way, home to people who didn't have many places where they felt seen. Doris Miller moved between the tables, with the slow, practiced motions of someone who had lived entire chapters of her life in places like this. She had arrived before dawn, as she did most days, tying her faded pink apron around her waist and pinning her graying hair into a bun that never quite stayed perfect past the breakfast rush. She didn't complain. She didn't have time to. Between 2 kids in school, medical bills for her aging mother, and the rent that seemed to climb faster than her paychecks, she had learned to live inside responsibility the way some people lived inside small houses, constrained but determined to make the most of it. Still, exhaustion clung to her this morning more stubbornly than usual. 3 weeks of double shifts had worn grooves into her bones. She told herself she was fine, that she'd push through, that the world didn't care how tired she felt. But even she couldn't deny that her smile today took more effort than anyone could see. She moved from booth to booth, refilling coffee cups, wiping crumbs, taking orders with a steady, practiced tone. Most customers greeted her politely. Some even asked how she was doing, though she kept her answers short, not wanting pity. Others simply nodded, grateful for hot food and a warm space on a chilly Oklahoma morning. Among them was a couple sharing pancakes near the front windows, an older man reading a newspaper with hands permanently stained from years of engine grease, and a pair of teenagers who seemed more interested in their phones than the food in front of them. But tucked into the farthest booth, near the wall where sunlight softened into shadow, sat a man who blended into the room so seamlessly he almost seemed part of it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a simple black jacket over a dark shirt, with his long hair pulled back neatly. A cup of green tea sat untouched in front of him, steam coiling upward like a silent whisper. He appeared calm, grounded in a way that felt different from everyone else. There was an unspoken stillness around him, the kind that makes people instinctively lower their voices without knowing why. He watched the room, not with suspicion or judgment, but with an almost meditative quiet. Anyone who glanced at him might have recognized him, though he never drew attention to himself. He didn't need to. His presence carried a weight that didn't require introduction. It was Steven Seagal, though in this place, in this moment, he was simply another traveler, stopping for a warm drink and a bit of stillness. For a time, the morning continued like any other, filled with quiet conversation, muted music playing from a small radio behind the counter, and the rhythmic footsteps of Doris moving from table to table. But at 9:17 a.m., that peaceful routine shattered. The door flew open with a force that made several customers flinch. A blast of cold air swept inside as a young man strutted through the entrance, carrying the kind of arrogance that announced itself before he even spoke. His hoodie was designer, his sneakers pristine white, and a smartphone was clutched in his hand as though it were his passport to superiority. His name was Trent Bishop, though in this part of Oklahoma he didn't need to introduce himself. His father owned half the new developments east of Tulsa strip malls, apartments, and the type of businesses that made small diners like this nervous. Even Doris tensed slightly when she recognized him. She had seen him once, years ago, causing a scene in a grocery store, while his father resolved things with a single threatening phone call. People learned quickly not to cross a bishop. Trent didn't wait to be seated. He strode to a booth, dropped into it with a sigh that suggested the entire world inconvenienced him, and tossed the menu onto the table like it offended him. When Doris approached with her usual gentle smile, he didn't look at her. Instead, he thrust his phone in front of her face and muttered something about terrible service already. She ignored the tone and asked him what he'd like to order. His reply was sharp, clipped, dripping with disdain. She wrote it down anyway, refusing to let his attitude set the tone for her day. But as she walked away, her stomach tightened. Something about him today was different, more volatile, more performative, the kind of mood that thrives on attention and cruelty. She whispered a quiet prayer under her breath that the food would come quickly and he'd leave without incident. When she returned with his order, carefully plated, she placed it in front of him with the same respect she gave every customer. But Trent didn't even glance at it. Instead, he wrinkled his nose and leaned back dramatically, giving her a look that dripped with staged disgust. Then, with a quick motion meant purely to humiliate, he spat directly onto the plate. A small gasp echoed from one of the nearby booths. Doris froze. Her mind stuttered, unable to process the level of disrespect she had just witnessed. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stood there for a moment, staring at the ruined food. She bent down slowly to pick up the plate, her hands only slightly trembling. But Trent shoved it off the table before she could reach it. The food scattered across the floor beside her shoes. She closed her eyes for just 1 second, grounding herself, swallowing the sting rising in her chest. Trent wasn't finished. He lifted his feet and slammed them onto the table, tracking dirt onto the clean surface. Then he angled his phone to record her reaction, a cruel grin slicing across his face. He mocked her, narrated the moment like some twisted spectacle. His voice rose, sharp and biting, filling the diner with a toxic energy that made every customer shrink into their seats. No one moved. No one spoke. The owner at the counter hesitated, torn between defending his employee and protecting his business from the influence of the Bishop family. At the far booth, Steven Seagal watched. He didn't flinch, didn't shift. His expression remained calm, unreadable. But his eyes, they tracked every detail. The trembling in Doris's hands, the way Trent's cruelty escalated, the fear that spread through the room. Something quiet stirred beneath his stillness, something steady and unavoidable. He wasn't a man who sought conflict, but he was a man who recognized when a line was being crossed. For now, he waited, observed, assessed. But the moment was coming when waiting would no longer be an option. The air inside Silver Pine Diner grew thicker with each passing second, as though the oxygen itself hesitated to move freely around the venom Trent Bishop was releasing into the room. Doris stood frozen beside the booth, her hands clasped tightly against her apron as she tried to steady her breathing. Her knuckles were pale, her lips pressed together in a trembling line. She had served rude customers before, endured offhand comments, impatient demands, even the occasional raised voice. But this was different. This was cruelty for the sake of cruelty, sharp and deliberate, committed by someone who believed himself untouchable. It wrapped itself around her like cold wire, biting deeper the longer it continued. Trent adjusted his phone, angling it upward to capture her humiliation more clearly. He chuckled under his breath, savoring every sound of distress he pulled from the room. The other customers watched helplessly, their expressions twisted in discomfort, their bodies tense but unmoving. No one wanted to be the one to stand up to the son of a man who could shut down entire businesses with a few well-placed threats. Even the owner remained behind the counter, gripping a dish towel so tightly the fabric had begun to fray in his hand. His eyes flicked between Doris and Trent, torn by the knowledge that stepping in might cost him everything he'd built. Steven Seagal watched the scene unfold with the calm, steady presence of someone trained to observe rather than react. He didn't rise. He didn't speak. But his focus sharpened, narrowing on Trent's posture, the aggression in the boy's shoulders, the trembling fear gathering behind Doris's eyes. Steven had spent decades studying human behavior, both on set and off. He could see the difference between someone who was angry and someone who was cruel. Someone who lashed out from pain and someone who inflicted it for sport. Trent was the latter. The room felt it, even if they didn't fully understand it. Trent's voice erupted again, louder this time, slicing through the diner's usual morning quiet. He complained about the food, the service, the pathetic dump of a place, raising his voice so everyone could hear his staged indignation. His cruelty escalated with each word, growing bolder with every second. The room remained silent. He leaned closer to Doris, pointing the camera at her face, as though she were nothing more than a prop in his performance. She stepped backward instinctively, but he followed, savoring the fear he ignited in her eyes. He picked up the ruined sandwich, pinched a piece between his fingers, and let it fall slowly toward her apron. It bounced off the fabric and landed at her feet. The motion was small, but the intent behind it was devastating. Doris recoiled, her breath stuttering. She blinked rapidly, fighting the tears threatening to rise. The room collectively flinched, but still, no one moved. Steven Seagal's tea had long since cooled, but he seemed unaware of it. His hands rested calmly on the table, his posture relaxed, but the stillness in his eyes had shifted into something heavier, something resolute. He had hoped the situation would de-escalate on its own. He had hoped Trent would tire of his performance, but the boy was spiraling deeper into his own show of false power, feeding on the terror of the room like it gave him life. Trent's excitement grew as he sensed the tension he created. He wanted more. He needed more. He lifted his phone again, zooming in on Doris as though trying to capture the exact moment her resolve snapped. He leaned forward, smirk curling into something predatory, and extended his hand toward her apron. His fingers brushed the fabric of her uniform in a deliberate gesture, wiping imaginary dirt onto her, as if she were nothing but a rag. Doris flinched away from the touch as though struck. That tiny reaction thrilled Trent. He let out a loud, mocking laugh, raising his middle finger inches from her face. The diner went silent again. Even the sound of bacon sizzling in the kitchen seemed to fade into nothing. Steven inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured. He placed his hand lightly on the table and pushed himself to his feet. The movement was quiet, so smooth it barely registered at first. But the moment he stood, the atmosphere shifted. Chairs creaked, heads turned. Even Trent's phone seemed to waver in his grip as he sensed someone stepping into his frame. Doris didn't immediately understand why the boy's expression faltered. She only realized someone was behind her when a broad shadow fell gently across her shoulder. She turned slightly and saw Steven standing there, his posture relaxed but grounded, as though he had all the time in the world and nothing in it could shake him. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and Trent. The action was slow, controlled, and deliberate, not a challenge, but a protective barrier. His presence alone felt like a shield. Doris felt her breath loosen just slightly, enough to steady her trembling hands. Trent stared up at Steven with confusion melting into irritation. He straightened in his seat, puffing himself up like a cornered animal trying to appear larger. "Move," he snapped, pointing the phone up at Steven's face. "I'm recording. You're interfering." Steven said nothing. He simply held the boy's gaze with a calm that sank deeper than any threat. Trent's face twitched at the absence of reaction. He expected anger, fear, something he could exploit. But Steven's composure made him feel unsteady. Trent stood abruptly, dragging his chair back with a harsh screech. He stepped closer, chest inches from Steven's. The two men were a study in contrast. One trembling with insecure rage, the other unmoving, grounded like an oak in a storm. Trent raised his chin defiantly, shoving his phone toward Steven's face. Still, Steven didn't speak. Trent needed control back. He needed dominance. He leaned in further and spat a string of threats, lawsuits, police calls, his father's influence, shutting down the diner. His voice cracked slightly at the edges, but he didn't seem to notice. He pointed at Steven's chest and shoved him. Steven didn't move, not an inch. Trent's shove bounced off him like a gust of wind hitting a stone wall. The lack of response snapped something inside Trent. His face twisted with a new kind of rage. He stepped back half a foot, lifted his leg, and launched a sloppy, unbalanced kick toward Steven's torso. The diner inhaled as one. Steven moved at the exact moment Trent's foot left the floor. He didn't step back or raise his arms. Instead, he shifted his center of gravity and lifted a single hand with effortless precision. His palm caught Trent's ankle midair, fingers closing around it with a grip that was firm but not painful. The momentum of Trent's kick evaporated instantly, leaving the boy momentarily suspended in disbelief. For one long second, the diner froze. The world held its breath. Then Steven gently guided the boy's leg downward, not violently, not aggressively, with the kind of practiced control that came from years of training and disciplines meant to neutralize, not harm. Trent stumbled backward, arms flailing as he scrambled to stay upright. He slammed into the edge of the table, his phone wobbling in his grip. His mask of arrogance cracked. Real fear flickered behind his eyes. Steven's expression never changed. Calm, steady, centered. Trent backed up a step, breath sharp and unsteady. He looked around, searching for validation, for someone willing to stand behind him. But every face reflected the same truth. They were done watching him. Done fearing him. Done playing his game. His power was slipping through his fingers, and no amount of shouting could pull it back. The room was no longer afraid of him, and for the first time, Trent Bishop understood what it felt like to be small. Trent Bishop stood frozen for a heartbeat too long, caught between rage, humiliation, and a dawning realization that he had lost control of the room. His chest heaved rapidly, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as he stared at Steven Seagal with a mixture of disbelief and fear. He had expected a reaction, anger, resistance, even violence. But instead he was confronted with a calm so steady it rattled him to his core. The customers around the diner watched silently, their gazes no longer avoiding the scene, but drawn to it, as though witnessing a truth they had known on some level, but had never seen so clearly. Trent was not the powerful force he believed himself to be. He was a boy out of his depth. The silence that settled over the diner was thick, almost suffocating. Trent's fingers tightened around his phone until his knuckles whitened, but his hand trembled, betraying him in a way he could not hide. He searched the faces around him, desperate for a hint of support, a familiar expression of fear that had always followed him in rooms where his father's name held weight. But now he only saw disappointment, frustration, and the beginnings of contempt. No one feared him. Not anymore. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow, and shoved a hand through his hair in an attempt to regain some semblance of swagger. "You think this is funny?" he spat, his voice cracking slightly despite his efforts to steady it. "You think you can just—" Steven didn't answer. He didn't even shift. His posture remained relaxed, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing calm. That stillness unnerved Trent more than any raised voice could have. He didn't know how to fight a man who refused to play the game he understood. Steven wasn't posturing, wasn't challenging, wasn't even angry. He was simply standing there, an immovable presence that Trent's theatrics couldn't dent. Trent's frustration boiled over into panic. He snatched the last soggy piece of food from the table with shaking fingers and hurled it toward Doris with a wild, desperate motion, as if humiliating someone, anyone, might restore his sense of dominance. But before the piece could reach her, Steven shifted half a step, an effortless, instinctive movement. The mushy remnant smacked harmlessly against his boot, sliding down the leather. He didn't look at it. He didn't acknowledge it. He simply stood his ground. The room exhaled in a collective whisper. Trent's face flushed a deep shade of red. His breathing quickened further, anger rising in a frantic crescendo inside him. He widened his stance, as though trying to appear larger, more threatening. But his legs shook beneath the weight of his own adrenaline. He could feel the eyes on him, judging, witnessing, evaluating. He had wanted to be the center of attention, but not like this. Not as the fool who couldn't control himself. He brandished his phone again, pointing it at Steven's face, as though the device could shield him from the truth unfolding around him. "You assaulted me," he snapped, voice too loud, too desperate. "You saw that. You all saw that. This guy's done." But no one moved. No murmurs of agreement rose. No sympathetic glances met his. The room remained steeped in silence, exposing Trent's lie with its very stillness. Even the teenagers, who rarely lifted their gaze from their phones, stared openly at him, unamused and unimpressed. His hand trembled harder. He took a step towards Steven, trying to regain the upper hand with sheer proximity. "Get out of my way," he demanded. But the words landed weakly, lacking conviction. He lifted his chin defiantly, yet his eyes darted anxiously toward the door, calculating an escape he refused to admit he needed. Steven didn't move. His calm was not a challenge, it was a boundary, a clear, unshakable one. Something inside Trent snapped. Whatever thin thread had been holding him together tore under the pressure of the moment. With a sudden, reckless surge, he lunged forward, throwing his full body weight towards Steven in a clumsy attempt to shove him aside. His arms extended, fingers splayed, posture wild and uncontrolled. It was the kind of desperate move that signaled not strength, but collapse. Steven shifted with a fluidity that seemed almost effortless. He stepped slightly to the side, letting Trent's forward momentum carry him past the intended target. As Trent lurched forward, Steven placed one hand firmly on the boy's shoulder, guiding him not with force, but with precise control. The motion redirected Trent's unstable energy downward, redirecting the aggression into gravity. Trent hit the floor hard. The sound echoed off the diner's tiled surface, a dull slap, followed by the skidding scrape of his palms. His phone flew from his grip and skittered across the floor, spinning to a stop near the base of the booth where the elderly couple sat. Trent lay still for a moment. The wind knocked out of him. His breath caught somewhere between shock and humiliation. His hair fell into his eyes, his hoodie bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. He looked less like the powerful tyrant he had attempted to be, and more like a lost child who had stumbled into a world he didn't understand. The diner erupted in a chorus of sharp inhales, but no one stood or spoke. They simply watched, seeing Trent clearly for the first time, without the shadow of his father, without the shield of money, without the armor of arrogance. Steven stepped back slightly, giving Trent space to gather himself. He did not hover. He did not advance. He did not taunt. He simply allowed the moment to sit in its natural balance, as though the fall had been an inevitable conclusion to the choices Trent had made. Trent pushed himself up painfully onto his elbows, his cheeks burning with humiliation. He tried to mask it with anger, but the trembling in his chin betrayed him. He whipped his head around, searching for someone, anyone, who might help him reclaim his image. But all he saw were witnesses to his downfall, witnesses who had no intention of pretending he was anything more than what he had shown himself to be. He scrambled to his knees, breath ragged. His palms were scraped, but it was his pride that seemed wounded beyond repair. His eyes flickered toward his phone, a lifeline lying several feet away, the shattered remains of his performance. He reached for it with shaky fingers, but even that gesture felt unsteady, desperate. He forced himself to his feet, wobbling slightly. He straightened his hoodie, trying to mask the tremor in his hands. He opened his mouth to speak, to reclaim his dominance with one final insult or threat, but the words caught in his throat. The power he believed he possessed had evaporated. The audience he had tried to command was gone, replaced by a room full of people who now saw him not as a menace, but as a cautionary tale. His gaze met Steven's again. One brief moment of raw vulnerability, and Trent looked away immediately. He backed toward the door, stumbling once as his heel caught on a chair. He steadied himself, cheeks burning hotter, and lifted his phone against his chest like a shield he no longer knew how to use. The diner felt too small, too bright, too honest. He didn't belong here. Not anymore. Without another word, he turned and pushed through the door, the bell above it chiming sharply as he exited into the cold Oklahoma air. Inside, the room remained still, suspended between shock and relief. The storm had not simply passed, it had collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind a quiet that felt like the first deep breath after nearly drowning. And Steven Seagal stood at the center of that quiet, not triumphant, not challenging, simply steady. A man who had intervened not out of anger, but out of principle. A man who had given someone their dignity back in the simplest of ways by refusing to let cruelty stand. For several long seconds after Trent Bishop stumbled out of Silver Pine Diner, the room held its breath, as though afraid that any sudden movement might pull him back inside. The bell above the door gave one last faint jingle, swaying gently before settling into silence. Only then did the atmosphere begin to loosen, like a fist unclenching after being held tight for too long. The tension that had gripped the diner seeped out slowly, leaving behind a hush filled with the echo of what had just happened. The customers looked around at one another, their eyes wide, their bodies still stiff from the adrenaline they hadn't allowed themselves to process until now. Doris stood near the booth where Trent had waged his cruel performance, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady her breathing. The events had unraveled so quickly that she felt disoriented, as though she had stepped through a whirlwind and was still trying to find solid ground beneath her feet. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the uneven rise and fall of her breath, the lingering ache of humiliation mixing with relief so powerful it nearly brought tears to her eyes. For weeks she had been running on empty, living shift to shift, moment to moment, but nothing had prepared her for what happened today. She blinked, wiped her palms against her apron, and turned toward the tall figure who had stepped between her and the violence that might have followed. Steven Seagal remained standing where he had been when Trent fled, calm and composed, his posture relaxed but unmistakably protective. He didn't look triumphant, didn't look angry, just centered, as though the storm that had shaken everyone else had passed by him without leaving even the faintest trace of disturbance. Doris opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. Gratitude felt too small for what she wanted to express, and she couldn't find a way to untangle the knot of emotion tightening in her chest. She took a step toward him, her voice barely above a whisper when it finally emerged. "Thank you," she said. Simple but genuine, heavy with meaning that needed no embellishment. Steven turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with eyes that were gentle, despite the intensity they had held moments earlier. He offered the faintest of nods, an acknowledgement that carried more weight than words would have. "You didn't deserve that," he replied quietly. "Nobody does." The softness in his voice steadied her more than anything else could have in that moment. It wasn't pity. It wasn't condescension. It was respect, the kind she hadn't felt in a long time from anyone other than her children. She exhaled shakily, feeling something inside her relax, for the first time since Trent had stormed through the door. The mechanic who had been reading his newspaper earlier rose from his booth and approached slowly, his expression solemn. He righted the chair that had been knocked over during the altercation and offered Doris a small nod of support before returning to his seat. The elderly couple near the window exchanged soft words with one another, their hands intertwined as they watched Doris with sympathetic eyes. Even the teenagers who had been absorbed in their phones now looked contemplative, as though seeing something entirely new in the quiet aftermath. The owner finally stepped out from behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously against his apron. His face was flushed, equal parts relief and shame etched into his features. He approached Steven with hesitant steps, unsure how to address a man who had done what he himself had been too frightened to do. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you," he managed, voice unsteady. "If you hadn't stepped in, I don't know what would have happened." Steven lifted a hand gently, halting the man's apology before it could grow too heavy. "You were looking out for your business," he said calmly. "People make hard choices when they're afraid. It's all right." The owner swallowed hard, visibly moved by the forgiveness he didn't feel he deserved. He gestured toward the menu board behind the counter. "Please, anything you want, on the house," he said. "A meal, dessert, coffee, anything." Steven shook his head, the refusal polite but firm. "Thank you," he said softly, "but I'm all right." The owner's shoulders sagged with gratitude anyway. He gave a tight, earnest nod before returning to the counter, glancing back at Doris with a look that silently promised they would talk later, that he would make things right. As the diner slowly pieced itself back together, customers began offering Doris small gestures, a warm smile, a quiet apology for not stepping in sooner, a gentle pat on the arm. None of them tried to erase what had happened. They simply wanted her to know she wasn't alone. She accepted their kindness with quiet gratitude, feeling her strength stitch itself back together one moment at a time. She moved toward the mess on the floor near Trent's booth, bending down to gather the scattered napkins and the overturned salt shaker. Steven stepped forward silently to help her, kneeling beside her and picking up the fallen condiments with a steady hand. He didn't hover or take over the task. He simply made it easier for her to breathe. "You're strong," he said gently, as he handed her a handful of napkins. "Stronger than I think you realize." Doris swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "I didn't feel strong today," she whispered. "Strength isn't about feeling it," Steven answered. "It's about standing when everything tries to push you down." And you stood. Doris blinked back tears, touched by the sincerity she heard in his voice. She placed the cleaned tableware onto her tray and stood up slowly. Steven rose beside her, towering but calm, giving her space. The atmosphere in the diner shifted subtly as conversations resumed, softly at first, then gradually building into the familiar morning hum. The kitchen sizzled again. The bell above the door chimed as new customers walked in, oblivious to the storm that had just ended. A sense of ease settled into the space, not because the memory of what had happened disappeared, but because something more powerful had taken its place, a reminder that kindness and courage still lived quietly in the world. Steven adjusted his jacket, turning toward the entrance. Doris watched him with a mixture of gratitude and admiration, unsure if she should say something more, or let him leave with the peace he carried so effortlessly, As he reached the door, he paused, looking back at her with that same steady gentleness. "Take care of yourself," he said, and tipped his head slightly in a gesture that felt like both farewell and blessing. She nodded, unable to speak past the swell of emotion in her chest. Steven stepped outside into the glowing Oklahoma sunlight, the warmth catching along the brim of his jacket and the length of his stride. He walked toward his vehicle with the same calm he had carried through the entire confrontation, his silhouette growing smaller as he moved toward the stretch of road beyond the diner. Inside, the Silver Pine Diner felt different now. The customers talked more softly, treated one another with more care, as though reminded of the fragility and dignity of the people around them. The mechanic paid for his meal with a quiet nod. The elderly couple lingered a little longer, watching Doris with warm smiles. Even the teenagers put their phones down, exchanging thoughts about what they had witnessed. Doris returned to her work with a steadiness she hadn't expected to find again today. She felt lighter, not because the world had grown easier, but because she knew that for one brief moment, someone had stepped into her life and reminded her that she mattered. That dignity could be defended, even when it felt fragile. That strength could be quiet and still change everything. And though Steven Seagal had walked out the door without fanfare, his presence lingered in the warm glances exchanged across the booths, in the renewed sense of safety drifting through the diner, in the unspoken understanding that goodness didn't always shout. Sometimes it simply stood up, acted with grace, and walked away quietly, leaving the world just a little better than it found it. Thanks for watching. Tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and leave a like.